Creepypastas. If you've been on the internet at all in the past decade, odds are you've come across a couple of these spooky stories. While there are many fantastic original stories and characters created by talented authors, there's just as many, if not more creepypastas that are based on existing franchises, with Pokemon being no exception. Now, since anyone with access to a computer can write some schlock and post it online, there are way too many stories to talk about in any single video. So today, we're going to take a look at some of the more iconic ones. So join me today as we take a look back at some Pokemon creepypastas. First up is Lavender Town Syndrome. This one has a very interesting history, as it's more of an urban legend than a creepypasta, but it definitely fits in with the others. This story claims that in the original release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan, the theme of Lavender Town was slightly different, with hidden, high-pitched frequencies that could only be heard by younger children. These frequencies would cause a plethora of symptoms, such as nausea, migraine, or even seizures in young players. These symptoms would eventually culminate in many young players supposedly taking their own lives. These incidents would be covered up by Nintendo in order to protect the Pokemon brand's popularity and innocence. The theme of Lavender Town would be altered for all releases outside of Japan in order to prevent such cases from ever happening again. Or they would have if any of this actually happened. Obviously, Pokemon Red and Green did not cause the death of children in Japan. There were no hidden frequencies or some big cover-up. I mean, with how big Pokemon was when it was first released, and how desperate certain groups were to paint Pokemon as a demonic or evil property, something of this magnitude could not have been swept under the rug so easily. This story was originally spread around sometime in 2010. Back then, trying to find information on the internet from 1996, when Red and Green came out, was pretty hard. Especially information from 1996 from Japan. Funnily enough, this lack of information made the story more believable since nobody could really find evidence to disprove it. Lavender Town Syndrome, while completely bogus, is one of the most infamous hoaxes of the Pokemon franchise, right up there with the Pokegods or Bill's Secret Garden, but those are topics for another day. Staying in Lavender Town, we have the most iconic Pokemon creepypasta by far, Buried Alive. The story goes that the boss at the end of Lavender Tower wasn't always the ghost of Marowak, but at one point in time was a rotting, living corpse. Following this text, the battle with Buried Alive would begin, with its team comprised of 4 extremely over-leveled Pokemon for this point in the game, with a level 90 Gengar, a level 94 Muck, and 2 White Hands. This creature is actually referenced in the final release of Pokemon Red and Blue, with an NPC outside of Lavender Tower claiming to see a white hand on your shoulder. This would again be referenced in the anime Pokemon Origins, with the white hand being visible on Red's shoulder. This battle would have 2 strange outcomes, as if you were able to beat Buried Alive in battle, your game would just freeze, preventing you from playing the game any further. If you were to lose, however, the dialogue, finally, raw meat, would be followed by a game over screen of Buried Alive devouring the player character. Basically, whether you win or lose the fight, the game becomes unplayable, which is cited as one of the main reasons this fight was scrapped and replaced with Marowak. And definitely not because the player's character would be eaten alive by a rotting corpse. This story, like the previous one, would sometimes be spread around as fact, but today there's no confusion as to the legitimacy of Buried Alive. Even so, it is remembered fondly as one of the first and most iconic Pokemon spooky stories. Moving over to the Johto region, we have the story of Lost Silver. This story quite literally dates itself, as the protagonist is eagerly waiting the release of Pokemon Heartgold and Soulsilver. In anticipation for the game's release, they decide to play through the original Pokemon Silver. After purchasing a copy, they hurried home to play their childhood favorite game. When starting up the game, the Game Freak logo would freeze. Eventually, the logo would disappear and hold on a dark screen for a few seconds, until the game would start. No title screen, no new game or save select. The game would just immediately load a save, and a pretty impressive save at that. Max playtime, all 16 badges, and a complete Pokedex. Their team, however, 5 unknowns and a Cyndaquil named Hurry, with the unknowns lined up to spell out leave. Strange, but maybe not as strange as where the player was. It appeared to be a part of Sprout Tower, but there were no NPCs, no ladders to upper and lower floors, and the center pillar wasn't shaking as normal. After wandering around for a bit, the player finally finds a hidden ladder behind the pillar, which takes him to a pitch black room. Thankfully, the Cyndaquil knows Flash, which they use to illuminate the area, revealing it to be a red-colored room with a gray path leading south. As the player follows the path, the screen darkens the further they go on. Eventually, they would reach the end of the path, where nothing but a sign was found. Turn back now. Suddenly, the player was given the choice yes or no. They weren't quite sure what the game was asking, so they picked yes. Hurry has fainted. The player checks their party, and Hurry is gone, with their whole team being unknowns, with a new message. He died. The player's attention was then drawn to their surroundings. A small gray room, only 4 tiles big, with gravestones lying outside the walls of the room. Seemingly stuck, they decided to check the trainer card. What they found was Gold Sprite had had his arms torn from his body, and a sad, empty look on his face. After wandering the room for a while, the player character suddenly did the escape rope animation downwards out of the room, landing in a similar room to that of the start of the game, though this time it was red in color. The player character was now a stark white color, as was the trainer card sprite, who was now missing his legs and had blood running from his eyes. Their team changed once again, a shiny Celebi, though its sprite was missing its left side, along with 5 unknowns, dying. The player headed north, eventually finding NPCs who, like Gold, were all white and would not interact with the player. They kept heading forward, reaching the end of the pillar, where a transparent Trainer Red stood. A battle immediately began. Despite having a party full of unknown, the player could only send out Celebi. Red also only had one Pokemon, Pikachu. It was level 255, with a sad look on its face. The Pokemon, bag, and run options were all gone. The only available choice was to attack. Celebi only had one attack, Perish Song. With no other choice, the player used it. The opposing Pikachu used a variety of strange moves, like Curse, Flail, Mean Look, and Frustration, which dealt a massive amount of damage. Eventually, Perish Song would take its effect. Celebi has died, though the Pikachu was still standing. It used a 5th move, Destiny Bond, before succumbing to the Perish Song. The player was seemingly the winner of the battle, while the red sprite now appeared beheaded. As the game returns to the overworld, the player was in their bedroom in New Bark Town. Gold is now fully transparent as Red was. The trainer card was nothing but Gold's head, and their team changed once again. Now, 6 unknowns. No more. After heading downstairs, they try to leave the house, but the player walks right past the door and into the dark void. They continue walking, eventually encountering a normal Gold sprite, which they attempted to interact with. Goodbye forever. It then vanished. As it did, something used Nightmare. The player character again did an escape rope animation downwards, landing in the small gray room from earlier. But the player's sprite was gone, both in the overworld and the trainer card. They checked their Pokemon once more, 6 unknown. I'm dead. After exiting back to the overworld, and as the final text spread across the screen, the player finally understood what was happening. This room was a grave. Gold was dead. And with this revelation, the game and the story come to a close. Man, that story is a lot longer than the others. While this story was well written and made a very big impact on the Pokemon fandom at the time, it's much more of a standard creepypasta, especially with the whole spooky cursed cartridge angle. That all being said, this story is still very iconic, being one of the poster children for Pokemon horror stories. Sure, it isn't exactly the scariest or most realistic story out there, but it's definitely earned its respect as a classic piece of Pokemon horror. The final story we're covering today is going to be Pokemon Black. Well, okay, yeah, no, not that Pokemon Black. Funnily enough, this story was released before Pokemon Black and White were released. To avoid confusion, this story nowadays is referred to as Pokemon Creepy Black. The story opens with our narrator, who is a collector of Pokemon bootleg games, naming classic titles like Pokemon Jade, Pokemon Diamond, and of course, Pokemon Chaos Black, before telling us of a new game he found at a flea market that he's never seen online. The cartridge itself was black, as was the label, simply having the Pokemon logo on the front. Upon starting up the game, the title screen was slightly off. Red is alone on the title screen, with no Pokemon beside him, as well as displaying the true title of the game, Pokemon Black version. The game was pretty much normal, up until the narrator goes to choose his starter, as in his party is one of the ghosts from Lavender Tower. The Pokemon was level 1, with only one move, Curse. When used in battle, Ghost could not be attacked, with the defending Pokemon being too scared to move. When Ghost used Curse, the screen would fade to black, as the cry of the opposing Pokemon would be heard. When the screen faded back in, the Pokemon was gone. The opposing trainer would even have one less Pokeball symbol, implying that the Pokemon was killed. Even stranger is after a trainer battle, the battle menu would stay on screen. If you ran away, the battle would end like normal, but if you select the fight option and used Curse, the trainer would disappear. With Ghost, the whole game was a wash, with the narrator clearing the Elite Four with zero difficulty. After the Hall of Fame screen, however, something new would happen. The player character is now an old man in Lavender Tower, surrounded by gravestones. The player was much slower, with no Pokemon, even Ghost, in their party. The overworld was deserted, with no signs of life anywhere the player went. Eventually, the narrator makes it back to Pallet Town, where the screen would cut to black, showing every single Pokemon and trainer the player had killed throughout the game. After this, a battle would commence. Ghost wants to battle. The player has no Pokemon, no items, can't run. All they can do is fight and struggle. After bringing your own health down as low as it can go, Ghost uses Curse. The screen cuts to black as the game freezes. This one is a much simpler story compared to that of Lost Silver, but a pretty good one all things considered. One thing I like about the story is how it paints the game as a weird bootleg or a ROM hack, rather than a supernatural cursed cartridge, like so many other creepypastas do. I also like how restrained the game is. Rather than the Pokemon and trainers being killed in some brutal fashion, it's done with a simple but effective cut to black. The story does just enough to be unnerving, but keeps itself grounded enough to make the game seem like something that could realistically exist. Speaking of which, this game, just like Lost Silver, has a playable version of the game online. I'll leave a link for both games in the description of the video, so you can experience these games for yourself. When it comes to creepypastas or any horror stories for that matter, I think the best ones are those that are able to blur the line between reality and fiction. The stories we've looked at today are all written in a way that they're just believable enough that they could fool some readers into thinking that they're real. Even if these tales are purely fictional, the fact that they could realistically happen is what makes them both scary and memorable. These stories were all made before 2012, over 10 years ago. But even after all these years, these stories are remembered and revered as some of the Pokemon fandom's most iconic and haunting bodies of work.